Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 601, Home Alone. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am off kilter. It is very, very strange not to have short stuff, the 6 foot tall short stuff, in the room next to me in the basement. It's just been a weird week all the way around. But I know I'm not the first one to go through this. And I'm going to try and get away, I think, this weekend or next, just to switch stuff up so that I'm not in the same place but different. I'll be in a different place and different. And that's, I think, maybe a little easier way to ease back into the new version of real life. That aside, one of the things that has been keeping me company this week, while Andrew is recovering from what looks like the flu, COVID tests have been negative, but Andrew definitely caught something on the plane back home. One of the things that's been keeping me company is the Oxford Medieval Mysteries by Anne Swinfen, Swinfen. The first one is The Bookseller's Tale. Each one of the books is called The Tale, kind of like Canterbury Tales. Get it? And the conceit of the books is that it's taking place, obviously, in Oxford, and it's taking place right after the plague. So the population has been decimated. It's kind of thrown society into an interesting kind of chaos because suddenly people can get paid more money to do things, or money at all to do things that perhaps they weren't going to get paid all that much for in the past. But now that there's nobody else doing it, changes the economy a little bit. It's an interesting view. She's clearly done her homework on how society worked at the time, the different jobs that people had, how the feudal landscape actually functioned, and they've been a really fascinating series of mysteries. They are not always murder mysteries. That would get a little tiresome and a little weird to, Miss Marple like having people drop dead around you all the time in a medieval context might get you burned more likely than not. So that's been fun. The drive across the country. Geez, this is your third drive across the country with me. Yeah. So 12 years, 3 cross-country trips. Not bad. The drive across the country was interesting in that there was significant road work being done in every single state we went through. And in New Mexico, that we finally saw signs that said, hey, New Mexico got this much money to do this major road work. And then the second sign following it, and we saw the set of signs twice or 3 times. The second sign following it was the name of the contractor that won the contract and their phone number, which was kind of cool. So yes, lots and lots of transportation infrastructure work being done. A lot of bridges getting fixed is the other thing we saw. So that was kind of cool. Payson, Arizona, in the White Mountains. Payson, Arizona wins for the best hotel. We stayed in Super 8s across the country because we were not looking for luxury. We just wanted to get there. And the Super 8s improved nightly. Waffle House in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the one on the western side of Tulsa on your way out of town, is next to the Super 8 is next to a Waffle House on the way out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Lisa, the server Lisa, was spectacular. She brought us back. Tuesday was a rough day. Monday was a weird day. Tuesday was rough. It started with a tornado warning that wasn't, and proceeded to be just a vast, vast foodless landscape. Every time we tried to stop and get food, it was just a mistake. So Lisa brought us back in Tulsa, which was very nice. But the real highlight of the trip happened at the very beginning, which was kind of sad because it would have been nice to save the best for last. But we started with the best, and that was getting to see our friend Laura Ricketts in Indiana. So our first day was our longest day, but so worth it. And Aiden just had the best time getting to meet Laura in person. And just so good. So good to see Laura and Chris again. Of course, all of our kids are flung to the winds at this point, so it's a weird world that we're in right now. We did keep a driving journal as we went across the country, and that is now in Aiden's possession, and I was a moron and didn't take pictures of any of the writing or sketches that I did in it. So someday, maybe, I will have some of those things back. But it was a beautiful trip. Absolutely beautiful. Lovely weather. Except that Tuesday and Wednesday, those were really hot days. It did hit 109 as far as the car temperature was concerned. Not as hot in New Mexico and Arizona, but then our elevation was quite high at that point. And it was really cool and lovely in Payson. But cool and lovely is not where we're at with poor Joan of Arc. Captured Joan. Poor captured Joan. So where do we leave off? We left off at the end of book 2. We are now beginning of book 3. We're going to do 3 chapters today. Chapters, I know this is shocking, 1, 2, and 3 of book 3. The first one kind of sets the larger stage, I guess, from a historical vantage point. The second one really picks back up with Louis de Camp's point of view. And then from this point on, and Twain has Louis de Camp be very clear about this as well, and includes a footnote too. From here on out, it's pretty much historical record. This is the section of the book that Twain was very careful to get right. Obviously, inserting his character of Louis de Camp into the narrative is a switch, but not that big a switch. You'll hear mention of a scribe, a guy who is going to be kind of the secretary for the trial. That's the real guy. As far as I could tell, that is the real guy who was the legit transcriber of the first trial. You may remember me telling you early on that part of the problem with the records from the first trial is that Couchon, who you will hear more about now, he was trying to set it up in a way that would make it possible for them to just trash Joan and her reputation and not make a martyr out of her no matter what happened. And in order to do that, it became clearer over time that the record of what Joan did and said in the court was going to need to be altered a bit in order to make her look bad, because she did a really good job of making herself look good. A lot of that information about how Joan actually came off looking pretty good wound up coming out in the later reconciliation trial. But the one thing that Twain was able to see in the original trial records that remain are the machinations of how they were pursuing Joan. So we're going to just get the barest outline today of how this is going to go down. And then next week we'll get into it more. For those of you who have not been enjoying Joan of Arc and actually stopped listening partway through, I suggest that now is when you pick it back up, because it's not Twainy, except in the fact that he is a cantankerous old man who got a little bitter about humans towards the end there. But it's not cutesy now. And the historical record is most likely one that will be new to you. It certainly was new to me when I read the book the first time. And this was the part that I think I found most intriguing. So let's go ahead and dive into Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, Book 3, Chapters 1 through 3, by Mark Twain, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Volume 2, Book 3, Trial and Martyrdom, Chapter 1, The Maid in Chains. I cannot bear to dwell at great length upon the shameful history of the summer and winter following the capture. For a while I was not much troubled, for I was expecting every day to hear that Joan had been put to ransom, and that the king—no, not the king, but grateful France had come eagerly forward to pay it. By the laws of war she could not be denied the privilege of ransom. She was not a rebel. She was a legitimately constituted soldier, head of the armies of France by her king's appointment, and guilty of no crime known to military law. Therefore she could not be detained upon any pretext if ransom were proffered. But day after day dragged by, and no ransom was offered. It seems incredible, but it is true. Was that reptile Tremouille busy at the king's ear? All we know is that the king was silent, and made no offer, and no effort in behalf of this poor girl who had done so much for him. But unhappily there was alacrity enough in another quarter. The news of the capture reached Paris the day after it happened, and the glad English and Burgundians deafened the world all the day and all the night with the clamor of their joy bells and the thankful thunder of their artillery, and the next day the Vicar-General of the Inquisition sent a message to the Duke of Burgundy requiring the delivery of the prisoner into the hands of the Church, to be tried as an idolater. The English had seen their opportunity, and it was the English power that was really acting, not the Church. The Church was being used as a blind, a disguise, and for a forcible reason. The Church was not only able to take the life of Joan of Arc, but to blight her influence and the valor-breeding inspiration of her name, whereas the English power could but kill her body. That would not diminish or destroy the influence of her name. It would magnify it and make it permanent. Joan of Arc was the only power in France that the English did not despise, the only power in France that they considered formidable. If the Church could be brought to take her life, or to proclaim her an idolater, a heretic, a witch, sent from Satan, not from heaven, it was believed that the English supremacy could be at once reinstated. The Duke of Burgundy listened, but waited. He could not doubt that the French king or the French people would come forward presently and pay a higher price than the English. He kept Joan a close prisoner in a strong fortress, and continued to wait, week after week. He was a French prince, and was at heart ashamed to sell her to the English. Yet with all his waiting, no offer came to him from the French side. One day Joan played a cunning trick on her jailer, and not only slipped out of her prison, but locked him up in it. But as she fled away she was seen by a sentinel, and was caught and brought back. Then she was sent to Beaurevoir, a stronger castle. This was early in August, and she had been in captivity more than 2 months now. Here she was shut up in the top of a tower which was 60 feet high. She ate her heart there for another long stretch, about 3 months and a half, and she was aware, all these weary 5 months of captivity, that the English, under cover of the Church, were dickering for her as one would dicker for a horse or a slave, and that France was silent, the king was silent, all her friends the same. Yes, it was pitiful. And yet when she heard at last that Compiègne was being closely besieged and likely to be captured, and that the enemy had declared that no inhabitant of it should escape massacre, not even children of 7 years of age, she was in a fever at once to fly to our rescue. So she tore her bedclothes to strips and tied them together and descended this frail rope in the night, and it broke, and she fell and was badly bruised, and remained 3 days insensible, meantime neither eating nor drinking. And now came relief to us, led by the Comte of Vendôme, and Compiègne was saved and the siege raised. This was a disaster to the Duke of Burgundy. He had to save money now. It was a good time for a new bid to be made for Joan of Arc. The English at once sent a French bishop, that forever infamous Pierre Cochon of Beauvais. He was partly promised the archbishopric of Rouen, which was vacant if he should succeed. He claimed the right to preside over Joan's ecclesiastical trial because the battleground where she was taken was within his diocese. By the military usage of the time, the ransom of a royal prince was 10,000 livres of gold, which is 61,125 francs, a fixed sum, you see. It must be accepted when offered. It could not be refused. Cochon brought the offer of this very sum from the English, a royal prince's ransom for the poor little peasant girl of Domremy. It shows in a striking way the English idea of her formidable importance. It was accepted. For that sum Joan of Arc, the savior of France, was sold to her enemies, to the enemies of her country. Enemies who had lashed and thrashed and thumped and trounced France for a century and made holiday sport of it. Enemies who had forgotten, years and years ago, what a Frenchman's face was like, so used were they to seeing nothing but his back. Enemies whom she had whipped, whom she had cowed, whom she had taught to respect French valor, new-born in her nation by the breath of her spirit. Enemies who hungered for her life as being the only puissance able to stand between English triumph and French degradation, sold to a French priest by a French prince, with the French king and the French nation standing thankless by and saying nothing. And she, what did she say? Nothing. Not a reproach passed her lips. She was too great for that. She was Joan of Arc. And when that is said, all is said. As a soldier, her record was spotless. She could not be called to account for anything under that head. A subterfuge must be found, and, as we have seen, was found. She must be tried by priests for crimes against religion. If none could be discovered, some must be invented. Let the miscreant Cochon alone to contrive those. Rouen was chosen as the scene of the trial. It was in the heart of the English power. Its population had been under English dominion so many generations that they were hardly French now, save in language. The place was strongly garrisoned. Joan was taken there near the end of December, 1430, and flung into a dungeon. Yes, and clothed in chains, that free spirit. Still France made no move. How do I account for this? I think there is only one way. You will remember that whenever Joan was not at the front, the French held back and ventured nothing. That whenever she led, they swept everything before them, so long as they could see her white armor or her banner. That every time she fell wounded or was reported killed, as at Compiègne, they broke in panic and fled like sheep. I argue from this that they had undergone no real transformation as yet, that at bottom they were still under the spell of a timorousness born of generations of unsuccess, and a lack of confidence in each other and in their leaders born of old and bitter experience in the way of treacheries of all sorts, for their kings had been treacherous to their great vassals and to their generals, and these in turn were treacherous to the head of the state and to each other. The soldiery found that they could depend utterly on Joan and upon her alone. With her gone, everything was gone. She was the sun that melted the frozen torrents and set them boiling. With that sun removed, they froze again, and the army and all France became what they had been before, mere dead corpses, that and nothing more, incapable of thought, hope, ambition, or motion. End of chapter 1. Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 2, Joan Sold to the English. My wound gave me a great deal of trouble clear into the first part of October. Then the fresher weather renewed my life and strength. All this time there were reports drifting about that the king was going to ransom Joan. I believed these, for I was young and had not yet found out the littleness and meanness of our poor human race, which brags about itself so much, and thinks it is better and higher than the other animals. In October I was well enough to go out with 2 sorties, and in the second one, on the 23rd, I was wounded again. My luck had turned, you see. On the night of the 25th the besiegers decamped, and in the disorder and the confusion one of their prisoners escaped and got safe into Compiègne, and hobbled into my room as pallid and pathetic an object as you would wish to see. What? Alive? Noel Rainguesson? It was indeed he. It was a most joyful meeting, that you will easily know, and also as sad as it was joyful. We could not speak Joan's name. One's voice would have broken down. We knew who was meant when she was mentioned. We could say she and her, but we could not speak the name. We talked of the personal staff. Old D'Aulon, wounded and a prisoner, was still with Joan and serving her, by permission of the Duke of Burgundy. Joan was being treated with respect due to her rank and to her character as a prisoner of war taken in honorable conflict, and this was continued, as we learned later, until she fell into the hands of that bastard of Satan, Pierre Cochon, Bishop of Beauvais. Noel was full of noble and affectionate praises and appreciations of our old boastful big standard-bearer, now gone silent forever, his real and imaginary battles all fought, his work done, his life honorably closed and completed. "And think of his luck!" burst out Noel, with his eyes full of tears. "Always the pet child of luck. See how it followed him and stayed by him from his first step all through, in the field or out of it. Always a splendid figure in the public eye, courted and envied everywhere, always having a chance to do fine things and always doing them. In the beginning called the Paladin in joke, and called it afterward in earnest, because he magnificently made the title good. And at last, supremest luck of all, died in the field, died with his harness on, died faithful to his charge, the standard in his hand, died, oh, think of it, with the approving eye of Joan of Arc upon him. He drained the cup of glory to the last drop, and went jubilant to his peace, blessedly spared all part in the disaster which was to follow. What luck! What luck! And we, what was our sin that we are still here, we who have also earned our place with the happy dead?" And presently he said, "They tore the sacred standard from his dead hand and carried it away, their most precious prize after its captured owner. But they haven't it now. A month ago we put our lives upon the risk, our two good knights, my fellow prisoners and I, and stole it and got it smuggled by trusty hands to Orleans, and there it is now, safe for all time in the treasury." I was glad and grateful to learn that. I have seen it often since, when I have gone to Orleans on the 8th of May to be the petted old guest of the city, and hold the first place of honor at the banquets and in the processions, I mean since Joan's brothers passed from this life. It will still be there, sacredly guarded by French love, 1,000 years from now. Yes, as long as any shred of it hangs together. Footnote 1. It remained there 360 years, and then was destroyed in a public bonfire, together with 2 swords, a plumed cap, several suits of state apparel, and other relics of the Maid, by a mob in the time of the Revolution. Nothing which the hand of Joan of Arc is known to have touched now remains in existence, except a few preciously guarded military and state papers which she signed, her pen being guided by a clerk or her secretary, Louis de Conte. A boulder exists from which she is known to have mounted her horse when she was once setting out upon a campaign. Up to a quarter of a century ago there was a single hair from her head still in existence. It was drawn through the wax of a seal attached to the parchment of a state document. It was surreptitiously snipped out, seal and all, by some vandal relic hunter, and carried off. Doubtless it still exists, but only the thief knows where. Translator. End of footnote number 1. 2 or 3 weeks after this talk came the tremendous news like a thunderclap, and we were aghast. Joan of Arc sold to the English. Not for a moment had we ever dreamed of such a thing. We were young, you see, and did not know the human race, as I have said before. We had been so proud of our country, so sure of her nobleness, her magnanimity, her gratitude. We had expected little of the king, but of France we had expected everything. Everybody knew that in various towns patriot priests had been marching in procession urging the people to sacrifice money, property, everything, and buy the freedom of their heaven-sent deliverer. That the money would be raised we had no thought of doubting. But it was all over now, all over. It was a bitter time for us. The heavens seemed hung with black. All cheer went out from our hearts. Was this comrade here at my bedside really Noel Rainguesson, that light-hearted creature whose whole life was but one long joke, and who used up more breath in laughter than in keeping his body alive? No, no, that Noel I was to see no more. This one's heart was broken. He moved grieving about, and absently, like one in a dream. The stream of his laughter was dried at its source. Well, that was best. It was my own mood. We were company for each other. He nursed me patiently through the dull long weeks, and at last, in January, I was strong enough to go about again. Then he said, "Shall we go now?" "Yes." There was no need to explain. Our hearts were in Rouen. We would carry our bodies there. All that we cared for in this life was shut up in that fortress. We could not help her, but it would be some solace to us to be near her, to breathe the air that she breathed, and look daily upon the stone walls that hid her. What if we should be made prisoners there? Well, we could but do our best, and let luck and fate decide what should happen. And so we started. We could not realize the change which had come upon the country. We seemed able to choose our own route and go whenever we pleased, unchallenged and unmolested. When Joan of Arc was in the field there was a sort of panic of fear everywhere, but now that she was out of the way, fear had vanished. Nobody was troubled about you or afraid of you, nobody was curious about you or your business, everybody was indifferent. We presently saw that we could take to the Seine, and not weary ourselves out with land travel. So we did it, and were carried in a boat to within a league of Rouen. Then we got ashore, not on the hilly side, but on the other, where it is as level as a floor. Nobody could enter or leave the city without explaining himself. It was because they feared attempts at a rescue of Joan. We had no trouble. We stopped in the plain with a family of peasants and stayed a week, helping them with their work for board and lodging, and making friends of them. We got clothes like theirs and wore them. When we had worked our way through their reserves and gotten their confidence, we found that they secretly harbored French hearts in their bodies. Then we came out frankly and told them everything, and found them ready to do anything they could to help us. Our plan was soon made, and was quite simple. It was to help them drive a flock of sheep to the market of the city. One morning early we made the venture in a melancholy drizzle of rain, and passed through the frowning gates unmolested. Our friends had friends living over a humble wine-shop in a quaint tall building situated in one of the narrow lanes that run down from the cathedral to the river, and with these they bestowed us, and the next day they smuggled our own proper clothing and other belongings to us. The family that lodged us, the Pirons, were French in sympathy, and we needed to have no secrets from them. End of Chapter 2. Volume 2, Book 3, Chapter 3, Weaving the Net About Her. It was necessary for me to have some way to gain bread for Noel and myself, and when the Pirons found that I knew how to write, they applied to their confessor in my behalf, and he got a place for me with a good priest named Manchon, who was to be the chief recorder in the great trial of Joan of Arc now approaching. It was a strange position for me, clerk to the recorder, and dangerous if my sympathies and the late employment should be found out. But there was not much danger. Manchon was at bottom friendly to Joan, and would not betray me. And my name would not, for I had discarded my surname and retained only my given one, like a person of low degree. I attended Manchon constantly, straight along, out of January and into February, and was often in the citadel with him, in the very fortress where Joan was imprisoned, though not in the dungeon where she was confined, and so did not see her, of course. Manchon told me everything that had been happening before my coming. Ever since the purchase of Joan, Cochon had been busy packing his jury for the destruction of the Maid. Weeks and weeks he had spent in this bad industry. The University of Paris had sent him a number of learned and able and trusty ecclesiastics of the stripe he wanted, and he had scraped together a clergyman of like stripe, and great fame here and there and yonder, until he was able to construct a formidable court, numbering 50 distinguished names. French names they were, but their interests and sympathies were English. A great officer of the Inquisition was also sent from Paris, for the accused must be tried by the forms of the Inquisition. But this was a brave and righteous man, and he said squarely that this court had no power to try the case, wherefore he refused to act. And the same honest talk was uttered by 2 or 3 others. The inquisitor was right. The case, as here resurrected against Joan, had already been tried long ago at Poitiers, and decided in her favor. Yes, and by a higher tribunal than this one, for at the head of it was an archbishop, he of Rheims, Cochon's own metropolitan. So here, you see, a lower court was impudently preparing to try and redecide a cause which had already been decided by its superior, a court of higher authority. Imagine it! No, the case could not properly be tried again. Cochon could not properly preside in this new court, for more than one reason. Rouen was not in his diocese. Joan had not been arrested in her domicile, which was still Domremy, and finally this proposed judge was the prisoner's outspoken enemy, and therefore he was incompetent to try her. Yet all these large difficulties were gotten rid of. The territorial chapter of Rouen finally granted territorial letters to Cauchon, though only after a struggle and under compulsion. Force was also applied to the inquisitor, and he was obliged to submit. So then the little English king, by his representative, formally delivered Joan into the hands of the court, but with this reservation: if the court failed to condemn her, he was to have her back again. Ah, dear, what chance was there for that forsaken and friendless child? Friendless indeed, it is the right word, for she was in a black dungeon, with half a dozen brutal common soldiers keeping guard night and day in the room where her cage was, for she was in a cage, an iron cage, and chained to her bed by neck and hands and feet. Never a person near her whom she had ever seen before, never a woman at all. Yes, this was, indeed, friendlessness. Now it was a vassal of Jean de Luxembourg who captured Joan at Compiègne, and it was Jean who sold her to the Duke of Burgundy. Yet this very de Luxembourg was shameless enough to go and show his face to Joan in her cage. He came with 2 English earls, Warwick and Stafford. He was a poor reptile. He told her he would get her set free if she would promise not to fight the English any more. She had been in that cage a long time now, but not long enough to break her spirit. She retorted scornfully, "Name of God, you but mock me. I know that you have neither the power nor the will to do it." He insisted. Then the pride and dignity of the soldier rose in Joan, and she lifted her chained hands and let them fall with a clash, saying, "See these! They know more than you, and can prophesy better. I know that the English are going to kill me, for they think that when I am dead they can get the kingdom of France. It is not so. Though there were 100,000 of them, they would never get it." This defiance infuriated Stafford, and now think of it, he a free man, strong man, she a chained and helpless girl. He drew his dagger and flung himself at her to stab her. But Warwick seized him and held him back. Warwick was wise. Take her life in that way? Send her to heaven stainless and undisgraced? It would make her the idol of France, and the whole nation would rise and march to victory and emancipation under the inspiration of her spirit. No, she must be saved for another fate than that. Well, the time was approaching for the great trial. For more than 2 months Cauchon had been raking and scraping everywhere for any odds and ends of evidence, or suspicion, or conjecture that might be usable against Joan, and carefully suppressing all evidence that came to hand in her favor. He had limitless ways and means and powers at his disposal for preparing and strengthening the case for the prosecution, and he used them all. But Joan had no one to prepare her case for her, and she was shut up in those stone walls and had no friend to appeal to for help. And as for witnesses, she could not call a single one in her defense. They were all far away, under the French flag, and this was an English court. They would have been seized and hanged if they had shown their faces at the gates of Rouen. No, the prisoner must be the sole witness, witness for the prosecution, witness for the defense, and with a verdict of death resolved upon before the doors were opened for the court's first sitting. When she learned that the court was made up of ecclesiastics in the interest of the English, she begged that in fairness an equal number of priests from the French party should be added to these. Cauchon scoffed at her message, and would not even deign to answer it. By the law of the Church, she being a minor under 21, it was her right to have counsel to conduct her case, advise her how to answer when questioned, and protect her from falling into traps set by cunning devices of the prosecution. She probably did not know that this was her right, and that she could demand it and require it, for there was none to tell her that. But she begged for this help, at any rate. Cauchon refused it. She urged and implored, pleading her youth and her ignorance of the complexities and the intricacies of the law and of legal procedure. Cauchon refused again, and said she must get along with her case as best she might by herself. Ah, his heart was stone. Cauchon prepared the procès-verbal. I will simplify that by calling it the bill of particulars. It was a detailed list of the charges against her, and formed the basis of the trial. Charges? It was a list of suspicions and public rumors. Those were the words used. It was merely charged that she was suspected of having been guilty of heresies, witchcraft, and other such offenses against religion. Now, by the law of the Church, a trial of that sort could not be begun until a searching inquiry had been made into the history and character of the accused, and it was essential that the result of this inquiry be added to the procès-verbal and form a part of it. You remember that that was the first thing they did before the trial at Poitiers. They did it again now. An ecclesiastic was sent to Domremy. There and all about the neighborhood he made an exhaustive search into Joan's history and character, and came back with his verdict. It was clear. The searcher reported that he found Joan's character to be in every way that he would like his own sister's character to be. Just about the same report that was brought back to Poitiers, you see. Joan's was a character which could endure the minutest examination. This verdict was a strong point for Joan, you will say. Yes, it would have been, if it could have seen the light, but Cochon was awake, and it disappeared from the procès-verbal before the trial. People were prudent enough not to inquire what became of it. One would imagine that Cochon was ready to begin the trial by this time, but no, he devised one more scheme for poor Joan's destruction, and it promised to be a deadly one. One of the great personages picked out and sent down by the University of Paris was an ecclesiastic named Nicolas Loiseleur. He was tall, handsome, grave, of smooth, soft speech, and courteous and winning manners. There was no seeming of treachery or hypocrisy about him, yet he was full of both. He was admitted to Joan's prison by night, disguised as a cobbler. He pretended to be from her own country. He professed to be secretly a patriot. He revealed the fact that he was a priest. She was filled with gladness to see one from the hills and plains that were so dear to her, happier still to look upon a priest and disburden her heart in confession, for the offices of the Church were the bread of life, the breath of her nostrils to her, and she had been long forced to pine for them in vain. She opened her whole innocent heart to this creature, and in return he gave her advice concerning her trial, which could have destroyed her if her deep native wisdom had not protected her against following it. You will ask, what value could this scheme have, since the secrets of the confessional are sacred and cannot be revealed? True, but suppose another person should overhear them. That person is not bound to keep the secret. Well, that is what happened. Cochon had previously caused a hole to be bored through the wall, and he stood with his ear to that hole and heard all. It is pitiful to think of these things. One wonders how they could treat that poor child so. She had not done them any harm.
So one of the things that struck me in these chapters was the mention of Joan in a cage. And I thought, well, that can't possibly be true. And apparently it was Hannibal Lecter-like. She was caged inside a cell. It was hard for me to tell if that was fictionalized versions of the horror of this poor girl being incarcerated as cruelly as she was, because there's no question about that. And it is true that she didn't have access to women very often. I don't know that it was true that she had no access to women or that women had no access to her. It was just not very often. And she did stay in her men's clothes for, well, it actually becomes an actual plot point later on. But for now, she is still wearing her men's clothes, although obviously not the armor anymore. And again, as we head into the rest of these last chapters of the book, Louis de Camp, obviously as a fictionalized character, was not there, but he is Twain's device for allowing us to see the trial from, and I'm putting air quotes in here, trustworthy eyes, not the eyes of the records that Couchon or Tremouille left behind. So that's how that's going to work. Yeah, it's not looking good. I mean, we know it's not going to be good, but how Joan behaves from here on out is, I think, one of the more stupendous parts of her story. I don't know any 17-year-olds who could have pulled off what she's about to do. So there we are. All right. You take care of yourself. As if COVID weren't enough, monkeypox and the flu are out and about. If you are curious about monkeypox, the TWIV clinical update from this last weekend, so that would be the clinical update from August 6th. And I'll put a link to this, the YouTube version and the show notes for this episode for 602. Monkeypox is a thing, and it is definitely in New York City, and it is definitely not AIDS-like, only infecting gay men. So part of the problem, just kind of like COVID, was that we weren't testing for it particularly intelligently, and as a consequence, we're missing instances. The other part of the problem is that the vaccine and the virals that we have that can help, they're not a slam dunk, but they can help. Sadly, there's a shortage. So that's a problem too. That means that unless you are sick and in a high risk category, chances are you won't be able to get access to any of the meds that might help alleviate some of it. And then, of course, the flu. If you have the Weather Channel app on your mobile device, this morning I scrolled down and saw flu in your area. So it's August and we're already getting flu reports. And again, this is contact tracing. This is the same kind of, and I'm using air quotes here, surveillance, which is the public health term that we try not to use publicly these days. But this is the kind of information that every state's Department of Health will collect. So whenever there's a lab test for the flu and it comes back positive, that information and the location information goes into the Department of Health's database. And in the case of the Weather Channel, Watson takes that data, aggregates it, and then is able to create a map that shows flu in your area so that you have an idea of what your flu risk is. As with COVID, influenza is a virus. That means that it is a very small particle. And if you are wearing purely cotton, broadcloth, plain weave, just a regular woven cloth like you'd use for a quilt, that's probably not going to do a whole lot for you against COVID and or influenza. But if you add another layer of something that is knitted or compressed, the way that compressed fibers like you would see in a HEPA filter for an air filter, or one of the layers of a surgical mask where you can see with your eyes that the fibers have just kind of been mishmashed and compressed together. A layer of that will go a long way towards trapping flu particulates so that you can stay away from that as well. Alrighty, I think that's it. You be well, take care of yourself, be good to yourself, be good to everyone else. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.